I still remember the morning my neighbor Linda called me over to the fence, laughing so hard she could barely breathe. She pointed down the road to old Ruth's place, Ruth Calloway, 72 years old, barely 100 pounds soaking wet, and there she was, dragging a pile of worn-out rubber boots from her garage, talking to herself, filling each one with dirt. Linda said, "Tom, that woman has finally lost it," and I thought maybe she's right. But by October, by the time the first real cold snap hit our little corner of rural Tennessee, Ruth Calloway had 400 onions drying in her cellar, and she hadn't spent a single dollar on new planters. Nobody was laughing anymore. Before we get into Ruth's story, if you enjoy real stories about real people, folks who figure things out the hard way, the honest way, take a second to subscribe to this channel. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I always love seeing where these stories travel. I've heard from people in Texas, in Scotland, in the Philippines, so wherever you are, let me know. Alright, let's get into it. Ruth Elaine Calloway was born in 1952 in a small farmhouse just outside of Crossville, Tennessee. The kind of place where you don't lock your doors at night, where everyone knows your daddy's name, and where the land is more friend than stranger. She was the third of 5 kids. Her mother canned green beans every August. Her father grew tobacco for years, then switched to corn when the prices dropped. From the time she was 8 years old, Ruth was in the garden. She knew what a sick tomato plant looked like. She could read the soil the way most people read a weather app. She married a man named Carl Calloway when she was 24. Carl was a decent man, quiet, hardworking, loved a good cup of coffee and the evening news. They built a simple life together, 2 kids, a vegetable garden in the backyard, church on Sundays, fried chicken on Fridays. Carl passed in 2019, heart attack, quick and quiet, the kind of death that leaves a house feeling 3 sizes too big. After that, Ruth kept to herself more. Her daughter lived up in Nashville. Her son had moved to Oregon years ago, good job, good family, but a long ways from Tennessee. Ruth wasn't the kind to complain. She'd wave at neighbors, bring cookies to the church potluck, tend her little garden. But here's the thing about Ruth, underneath all that quiet, there was something stubborn. She had this way of setting her jaw when she'd made up her mind, just a slight shift in the chin, and when you saw that look, you knew she wasn't going to budge. By the spring of 2022, she was living on a fixed income. Social Security, a small pension from Carl's years at the plant. It was enough to keep the lights on and the pantry stocked, but not enough to feel easy, not enough to feel like she had breathing room. And the price of groceries was getting to her. Every week she'd go to the Food Lion. It used to be the Piggly Wiggly. They changed it a while back, and every week the same bag of onions cost a little more. Little things, you know, but they add up. They wear on you, especially when you're alone and watching every dollar. So Ruth started thinking, and when Ruth Calloway started thinking, things had a way of starting to happen. The goal was plain enough, at least in Ruth's mind: grow her own food. Not all of it. She wasn't trying to prove anything or live off the grid. She just wanted to stop dreading that produce aisle. She wanted to put up enough onions, tomatoes, and greens to get through winter without feeling that pinch in her chest every time she opened her wallet. Now Ruth had a small garden plot out back, always had, but the yard wasn't big. And this year she wanted to go bigger. She wanted to actually put food by, fill that old cellar under the house that Carl had lined with shelves years ago, and that had been sitting mostly empty ever since. But there was a problem, always is, isn't there? Ruth didn't have money for planters, not the big kind, not if she wanted to grow 400 onion sets, which is what she'd read about in an old gardening book she found at the library sale for 50 cents. The book said if you planted enough, really committed to it, you could have onions through the whole winter and into spring. Braided onions, cured onions, onions so plentiful you'd be giving them away. Ruth wanted that. She wanted that full cellar, something fierce. And she'd already decided she wasn't going to let money stop her. She was going to figure it out the way her mother had always taught her, with what she had. She walked out to her garage one Saturday morning in late March and looked around. Old tools, paint cans, a broken lawnmower Carl had never gotten around to fixing, and in the corner a pile of old rubber boots, work boots, rain boots, boots that had outlasted their usefulness a dozen times over. She stood there a long moment, and then that jaw of hers shifted. She went inside and came back with a pair of scissors and a permanent marker. Word travels fast in a small town, always has, always will. By the time Ruth had lined up 20 boots along her front walkway and filled them with garden soil and compost, at least 4 of her neighbors had already slowed their cars to look. Linda, my neighbor Linda, who'd called me over that first morning, was the most vocal. She didn't mean any real harm. Linda's just the kind of woman who says what she thinks before she's finished thinking it. She posted something on the neighborhood Facebook group, something along the lines of, "Has anyone checked on Ruth Calloway? She's planting things in old boots in her front yard. God bless her." The comments weren't kind. A few folks were genuinely concerned, but more than a few were just snide. Someone suggested Ruth needed to move somewhere with a homeowners association. Someone else cracked a joke about property values. One person, I won't say who, said it looked like a yard sale that never ended. Ruth's daughter Angela called from Nashville the same day. Angela is a good woman, but she's a worrier. She told Ruth the whole thing looked eccentric. She used that exact word, which, coming from a daughter, is really just a polite way of saying embarrassing. "Mama, what are people gonna think?" Angela said. Ruth told her, "I think they're going to think I'm growing onions." But here's where the conflict got real, and I mean genuinely real. It wasn't only the neighbors, it was the garden itself. Ruth's front yard caught decent light in the morning but was shaded by a big oak in the afternoon. She didn't know if the onions would get enough hours of sun. She'd never grown in containers before. She didn't know if the boots would drain right, or if the soil would stay too wet, or if the whole thing would just rot where it stood. She was 72 years old, trying something she'd never done, being laughed at by people she'd known for 30 years, with no guarantee any of it would work. That's the kind of thing that stops most people cold. Ruth planted the next row of boots anyway. Now here's where the story takes a turn, and I mean the kind of turn where you start paying attention differently. A few weeks after Ruth planted her first batch, she found something in her mailbox. Not a bill, not a flyer. A handwritten note on plain white paper, no return address, that said only, "You're not as alone as you think. Check the fence post by the old elm." Ruth stood at the end of her driveway for a good minute, reading that note over and over. Then she walked to the back corner of her property, to the old split-rail fence, to the big elm that had been there longer than the house itself. Tucked into the gap between two fence posts, a small paper bag, inside onion sets. 100 of them at least, a variety she didn't recognize, with a little handwritten tag that read "Walla Walla Sweet." No name, nothing else. Now who does something like that? Who watches a 72-year-old woman planting onions in old boots, getting laughed at by half the neighborhood, and then quietly drops off more supplies? Ruth had a guess, but she didn't go knocking on doors to find out. She added the new onion sets to her planting list and kept going. Then something else happened. A man from 3 streets over, name of Dennis, a retired school principal, late 60s, showed up one Tuesday with a wheelbarrow full of old rain boots from his storage shed. He said, "I heard what you were doing, thought you might be able to use these." He didn't stay long, didn't make a production of it, just left the boots and walked home. Then the hardware store on Main Street started getting calls. Folks asking about onion sets, container gardening, boot drainage. The owner told me later he didn't put it together at first, didn't realize all these separate customers were connected to one woman on Cedar Grove Road. Ruth hadn't set out to start anything, she was just trying to fill her cellar. But something was happening, something quiet and slow, the way the things that actually matter usually are. And still, nobody knew about the note, nobody knew about the Walla Walla sweets, nobody knew who left them. Nobody except Ruth, and maybe one other person. I want to be honest with you here because this story is real, and real stories have hard parts. Ruth had a rough week in late May. Her knee was acting up, old arthritis, the kind that doesn't much care whether you have planting to do. She woke up one Wednesday and couldn't put full weight on it. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looked out at the front yard, at all those boots lined up like mismatched soldiers, and she cried. Not because of the knee, well, partly, but really because Carl should have been there. Carl would have loved this whole project. He would have been out there drilling drainage holes with that ancient Black & Decker of his, grumbling about the humidity, telling Ruth she'd gone crazy, and grinning the whole time. She missed him. She missed him the way you miss something that was holding you upright without your knowing it. She thought about quitting that week, she really did. But Saturday turned things around. 2 things happened back to back. First, she noticed the earliest planted boots were pushing up shoots. Healthy, upright, a deep, confident green, those onions were growing. She stood on her front porch in her slippers and laughed out loud, the kind of laugh that catches you off guard, that comes up from somewhere below the throat. Second, and this one I didn't find out about until later, sitting with Ruth over sweet tea on her back porch, she got a call from her son James in Oregon. He'd seen Linda's Facebook post. And instead of calling to lecture her the way Angela had, James said, "Mama, I'm looking up boot garden tutorials right now. Tell me what you need me to know." They talked for 2 hours. Ruth told me she couldn't remember the last time they'd gone that long. James sent her a hand-drawn diagram in the mail a week later, a layout plan for positioning the remaining boots to get the best out of the afternoon light they did have. The man had done actual research for his mother and her boot garden. Ruth put that diagram on her refrigerator with a sunflower magnet. She didn't quit. Here's the part I didn't see coming, and I don't think you will either. By July, the boot garden had become something of a local fixture. People drove past slowly. Some were still smirking, but a lot of them were just curious now. A few had started pulling over to ask Ruth about it, and Ruth, being Ruth, never passed up a chance to talk about her onions. One afternoon in mid-July, a young woman stopped in front of the house. 25, maybe 26. Dark hair, tired eyes, she was pushing a stroller. She stood there looking at the boots for a while, then called out, "Did this really work?" Ruth came down off the porch. "Come look for yourself." The young woman's name was Destiny. She was a single mother living in the apartment complex 2 blocks over, working 2 jobs. She told Ruth she'd been seeing the Facebook posts, not the mean ones, but the follow-up ones where people had started sharing photos of their own boot gardens, their own balcony setups, all of it tracing back to Ruth. "I don't have a yard," Destiny said. "I've got a balcony, and I've got $12. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she went back to the garage and came out with 4 boots, mismatched, worn out, perfect, and a bag of potting soil she'd been holding on to. She handed it all over like it was nothing. "Onions are forgiving," Ruth said. "They want to grow, you just have to give them a chance." Destiny stood there in the front yard and cried, over a bag of dirt and 4 old boots. Ruth put a hand on her shoulder and told her to come back Thursday. She'd have onion sets ready. Now here's the part that knocked me sideways when I finally found out. The handwritten note in Ruth's mailbox, the Walla Walla sweets tucked into the fence post. It was Destiny. She'd spotted Ruth from a bus window 3 weeks earlier, planting alone, neighbors slowing down to stare. She'd gone home and spent her own grocery money on those onion sets, written the note at her kitchen table at midnight after the kids were down. She just wanted someone to keep going. "Let me paint you a picture of that garden in late July. I want you to really see it." The boots are lined up in 3 long rows along the front walkway, each one a different color, a different history: rubber rain boots in yellow and red and green, old lace-up work boots the color of dried mud, even a pair of cowboy boots with roses stitched up the sides. Every one of them is packed with dark soil, and from the top of each, onion stalks rise straight and sure, swaying just slightly in the Tennessee heat. Ruth's front porch has a tin wind chime that makes a soft, hollow sound. The screen door has a creak you'd recognize from 100 feet away. In the mornings, she comes out with a watering can, barefoot on the warm concrete, moving down the rows slowly and deliberately, the way a person moves when they've settled into something. The smell is the part no photograph can get across. Onion and warm soil and fresh-cut grass hitting you halfway up the front walk. It's not delicate, it's alive. The neighbors have mostly stopped smirking. There's a man across the street, retired vet, doesn't say much, who started sitting on his porch evenings just to look at the garden. Ruth told me he came over once and stood at the fence for a minute, said, "My mama used to do something like this." Then he went home, that was all. By early August, you could see what Ruth had been building all along. The stalks tall, the bulbs swelling, the cellar door at the back of the house standing open in the mornings, ready. The harvest was coming. October came early that year, or at least it felt that way, that particular quality of October light that makes everything look like a painting, golden and long-shadowed, the kind that makes you stop and just look for a moment. Ruth spent 3 full weekends pulling onions. Her daughter Angela drove down from Nashville for the second one, arrived Friday evening with a lasagna and a pair of garden gloves, and didn't say a single word about the boots. She just put the gloves on and got to work. James called from Oregon every evening that week. He'd ask, "How many today, Mama?" And Ruth would tell him, 212, 270, 341. "Keep going," James said every night, "keep going." By the second Saturday in October, Ruth had 418 onions cured and hanging in her cellar, braided in long ropes the way her mother had taught her. Yellow onions and Walla Walla sweets, Destiny's gift, filling the shelves Carl had built. That afternoon, Ruth sat down on the cellar steps and stayed there a while. Angela was upstairs making coffee. Ruth could hear the old house doing what old houses do, the refrigerator hum, a car passing on the road outside, wind through the window screens. And there in that cellar, surrounded by 418 onions and the deep smell of earth and work and harvest, Ruth cried. But not like that Wednesday in May, not the grief kind. This was something else, something that doesn't have a clean name. Gratitude and exhaustion and pride and loneliness and love all at once, the way a long project will make you feel when it's finally truly done. She thought about her mother who'd done this same work in harder times without complaint. She thought about Carl, who would have been hollering about onion smell in the house for the next 6 months, grinning through every word of it. She thought about James and his hand-drawn diagram on the refrigerator, about Angela in the garden with gloves on, no questions asked. She thought about Destiny, 25 years old, 2 jobs, 2 kids, spending her own grocery money on onion sets for a woman she'd never met. She said it out loud to no one in particular, to the cellar, to Carl, to whoever might be listening. I did it. Then she got up, climbed the steps, and went to have coffee with her daughter. Here's what happened after. Ruth's onions lasted through the entire winter and into February. She gave bags of them to Dennis, who dropped off that wheelbarrow of boots back in the spring. She left a bag on Destiny's doorstep at the apartment complex with a note that read, "Thank you, you kept me going." Destiny had grown 6 onions on her balcony that fall, 6 in 4 old rubber boots. She told me it was the first thing she'd ever grown in her life. The neighborhood Facebook group, the same one where people had piled on with their snide comments, turned into something different. Folks started posting their own container gardens. Boot gardens, bucket gardens, crate gardens. One woman grew tomatoes in an old broken cooler. A family around the corner turned 3 cracked laundry baskets into a raised herb bed. Somebody even planted in an old toilet, which I thought was a step too far, but who am I to say? Ruth was the start of it, though she'd tell you she wasn't trying to start anything. She was just trying to feed herself. Angela came back down in the spring to help plant again. She calls it her April tradition now. James is flying out to Tennessee this summer, first visit in 4 years. He told Ruth he wants to see the boot garden in person. And Ruth is already planning this year's crop. A second variety of onion, maybe garlic, maybe some winter squash and a few old 5-gallon buckets she picked up at the hardware store. She told me, "Tom, I'm not trying to impress anybody. I'm just trying to eat well and not pay too much for the privilege." I told her that was about as good a goal as a person could have. There's a lesson in Ruth's story, a few of them really, but the one that stayed with me is this. When you start doing something real, something honest and unglamorous and a little bit ridiculous, you find out who your people are, you find out who laughs at you, yes, but you also find out who shows up with a wheelbarrow, who puts a diagram in the mail, who leaves onion sets at the fence post at midnight because they can't afford to let you give up. Ruth didn't set out to build a community, she set out to grow onions, but sometimes the thing you plant turns out to be bigger than what you intended. I think about Carl a lot when I tell this story. He would have loved every bit of it, the boots, the neighbors, the mystery note, all of it. He'd have been out there in his old work pants griping about the drainage holes and quietly proud of every last onion. And I think about Destiny, 25 years old, 2 jobs, 2 kids, $12 a paper bag, and a note written at midnight. That's the kind of thing that makes you believe in people again, when you'd maybe started to forget why you should. Ruth Calloway's cellar was full by October, and so was something else, something harder to name and harder to grow, but every bit as necessary. Plant your boots, friends, you never know what's going to come up. If this story meant something to you, hit that subscribe button. We've got more just like it, about real people doing real things that matter. And before you go, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and which part of Ruth's story stayed with you. I read as many as I can, and honestly, hearing from you is one of the best parts of doing this. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.